Caleb Rowan stood as Vivian Wexford pushed the compensation sheet across the table and told him the company did not pay extra for someone simply doing his job. The number had been cut almost in half, even though Caleb had just saved the biggest contract of the year. The room went quiet. Vivian even smiled, reminding him that a single father should be grateful to have a job at all. Caleb did not argue. He signed the form, stood up, and walked out. But before the elevator doors could close, his phone lit up. Her biggest rival was calling. At Wexford Meridian Group, Caleb had spent nearly 8 years building a reputation nobody in the building could quite put into words, though everyone recognized it the moment a client called in a panic, and someone on the executive floor said the same 4 words. Without thinking twice, get Rowan on the call. He never had the largest office or the flashiest title, but when accounts started slipping and relationships started fraying, his name was the one people reached for first. 3 months earlier, Redmont Aviation, the firm's largest client and the anchor of nearly a quarter of its annual revenue, had come within days of walking away after a botched transition left their leadership furious and their trust in tatters. Vivian had not stepped in personally. Instead, the account had landed on Caleb's desk with a single instruction from above: fix it quietly and fix it fast. For 6 weeks, he had rebuilt the entire plan from scratch, running early morning calls before the rest of the office had even opened its doors, coordinating 3 departments that rarely spoke to one another, and slowly earning back the confidence of a client that had already begun drafting termination paperwork. By the time Redmont agreed to extend, the company had hit its quarterly revenue target almost entirely because of that single recovery. And under the internal performance framework, Caleb was positioned for the strongest bonus of his career. He never advertised it. He simply did the math quietly at his desk one evening, thinking of the modest financial breathing room it might finally give him and his daughter, Avery, whose text message he glanced at just before leaving that night, asking whether he would make it home in time for dinner. "Dad is almost done," he wrote back, the way he always did, the way that had quietly defined most of the last several years of his life. It was one of the only glimpses into his life outside those glass walls, and it would stay that way for the rest of the story. A few days later, a calendar invitation appeared in his inbox with a title that made him allow himself, just for a moment, a small flicker of hope. Third Quarter Performance Compensation Review, Executive Floor. He assumed, reasonably, that the company was finally about to acknowledge what he had done. Long before Redmont, Caleb had quietly built a track record that most people outside his direct chain of command never fully saw. There had been a logistics client 2 years earlier who nearly walked away over a missed shipment window, calmed only after Caleb spent a weekend on the phone, learning the operational details nobody else had bothered to ask about. There had been a regional retail account the year before that, saved not through a dramatic gesture, but through a simple habit, sending a short recap after every call so nothing ever slipped through the cracks the way it did with other account teams. Colleagues joked that Caleb kept an entire second memory of the company inside his head. Every promise made, every deadline slipped, every executive who had once said something in a meeting and then forgotten it by the following week. Younger account managers occasionally sought him out for advice, not because he offered dramatic strategies, but because he had a habit of asking the one question everyone else in the room had somehow missed: whether the plan on the table actually solved the client's real problem or simply looked good inside a presentation deck. He answered those questions the same patient way every time, never rushing anyone toward an answer, treating each conversation as though it deserved his full attention, regardless of how busy his own schedule happened to be that week. He never used that memory as leverage. He used it the way a good mechanic uses a checklist, quietly, without needing anyone to notice the discipline behind it. The meeting took place on the 41st floor, in a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows and a long glass table that always felt colder than the room actually was. Vivian sat at the head of it, flanked by the chief financial officer, Edwin Carrick, the head of human resources, and two vice presidents who rarely spoke unless spoken to. She opened by praising the retention of Redmont Aviation, though the way she phrased it left Caleb's name almost entirely out of the sentence. The team saved Redmont, she said, as though the 6 exhausting weeks had simply happened on their own. Caleb noticed the omission immediately but said nothing, waiting, instead, for the number that was supposed to follow the praise. When the compensation sheet finally slid across the table, the figure on it was nearly half of what the internal formula should have produced. He asked, calmly, which metric had driven the reduction. Vivian answered with 2 words, executive discretion, delivered with the flat confidence of someone who had never expected to be questioned. Caleb pointed out, without raising his voice, that he had exceeded every single target that quarter, and that the numbers were not in dispute anywhere in the building. Vivian's expression shifted, the mild irritation of someone unused to being challenged in front of her own leadership team. "You have a salary, Caleb," she said, and then added that plenty of people, raising a family on their own, would be grateful just to have that much security. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. She pressed further, telling him that stability should matter more to a single father than a bonus, as though his household had become a bargaining chip she was entitled to use. Caleb did not flinch, though something in his chest went very still. He asked only one question in response: whether Redmont counted when the company reported its revenue, but somehow stopped counting the moment his own performance was being reviewed. Vivian's answer arrived cold and immediate, telling him not to confuse being useful with being irreplaceable. One of the vice presidents, a quiet man named Thomas Neal, who rarely spoke in these meetings, shifted uncomfortably in his seat but said nothing, the way most people in that room had learned to say nothing whenever Vivian set the tone for a conversation. The head of human resources glanced down at her folder instead of meeting Caleb's eyes, and Edwin Carrick simply tapped his pen against the table, waiting for the moment to pass the way he waited for every uncomfortable moment in that building. Nobody defended him, and nobody was expected to. Caleb understood, in that silence, that the discomfort in the room was not going to translate into anyone actually standing up for the number he had earned, and that understanding settled into him with more weight than the number itself ever could have. He looked down at the sheet for a few seconds longer than necessary, then reached for the pen and signed to confirm he had received the notice, offering no further argument, no raised voice, nothing that would give the room a reason to remember the meeting as anything other than routine. As he gathered his folder and stood, Vivian was already turning back to Edwin, dismissing the moment before Caleb had even left the room. He walked out through the long hallway toward the elevators, past the assistants who had learned years ago not to make eye contact during tense afternoons, past the wall of framed client logos that included Redmont's name near the top. Behind the closed door, Vivian told Edwin not to worry, that Caleb would cool off in a day or two because, in her words, he needed the job too much to actually leave. Caleb did not slam a door. He did not raise his voice or throw anything or turn back for one last argument. The change that happened inside him was much smaller and far more permanent. The quiet decision, after 8 years, to stop finding reasons to defend a company that had just spent an entire meeting explaining why his daughter's stability made him easier to underpay. Waiting for the elevator, his mind went, almost involuntarily, to a name he had not let himself think about in months: Grant Holloway, the chief executive of Holloway North and Pierce, the largest direct competitor Wexford Meridian had in the entire market. 6 months earlier, Grant had personally offered him the role of Vice President of Strategic Accounts, a position with a significantly higher salary, a guaranteed bonus structure, and more importantly, direct authority over how client relationships were actually run. Caleb had turned it down at the time, still convinced that loyalty would eventually be recognized where he already stood. Grant had accepted the refusal without pressure, saying only one thing before they parted ways, that the offer would still be there whenever Caleb finally understood what his loyalty was actually worth. He remembered the afternoon Grant had first made the offer, sitting across from him at a quiet restaurant far from either office, laying out the role without any pressure attached to it. Grant had not tried to poach him with flattery or urgency. He had simply described what accountability looked like inside his own company, a structure where the person who built a client relationship was the person trusted to keep running it, rather than someone whose success quietly became raw material for someone else's quarterly narrative. Caleb had turned the offer down that day out of a loyalty he still believed at the time was mutual. Grant had not pushed back or tried to sweeten the deal on the spot. He had simply folded his napkin, thanked Caleb for hearing him out, and said the one line that had apparently been waiting patiently in the back of Caleb's mind ever since. Standing in that hallway, phone in hand, Caleb opened the old thread and found Grant's final message still sitting there from months earlier. Offer stands longer than you think. He typed 2 words back, still open, and pressed send before he could talk himself out of it. He reached out and pressed the elevator button. His phone rang before the doors had even opened, Grant Holloway calling within seconds of reading the message. There was no small talk. "What happened?" Grant asked, and Caleb answered honestly, telling him he had finally understood exactly what Grant had meant all those months earlier. Grant explained that the legal team had actually refreshed the offer just weeks earlier, unprompted, because Holloway, North, and Pierce had never stopped wanting him on their team. An email arrived in Caleb's inbox before the call even ended, a salary increase of roughly 35%, a guaranteed first-year bonus, full authority to build his own account team, and the title of vice president waiting for his signature. There was no dramatic pause on the line, no attempt from Grant to sweeten a deal that had never needed sweetening in the first place. Only the same steady patience that had first drawn Caleb to consider the offer months earlier. Grant told him there was no rush, that he did not need an answer that night, but Caleb looked back down the hallway toward the conference room, where the meeting had just ended, and answered anyway, telling him he already had one. He signed electronically right there in the hallway, and a confirmation screen appeared almost instantly, welcoming him to Holloway, North, and Pierce. The elevator doors opened at exactly that moment, as though the timing itself understood the weight of what had just happened. Behind him, Vivian Wexford had spent the last 10 minutes cutting the bonus of a man she believed she could never lose, without knowing that by the time he reached the lobby, she already had. Just as the doors began to close, Edwin Carrick came jogging out from the conference room, slightly out of breath, telling Caleb that Vivian wanted him back inside. Caleb held the door open for a moment, long enough to answer calmly that he had another meeting, and then let the doors close between them. The next morning, Caleb submitted a formal, professional resignation letter, giving proper notice and offering a full transition plan. Vivian called him into her office almost immediately, and there was no apology waiting for him when he arrived, only the assumption that this entire gesture was some elaborate attempt to renegotiate his bonus. "If this is about the money," she said, "this is a very dramatic way to ask for a raise." Caleb placed the signed offer letter on her desk without a word. She read the letterhead, Holloway, North, and Pierce, and her expression shifted in a way Caleb had never seen on her before, the first real crack in 8 years of composure. For a moment she said nothing at all, clearly recalculating everything she thought she understood about the conversation happening in front of her. For a moment, Vivian actually considered whether there was any version of this conversation where she came out ahead, running through the calculations the way she ran through every negotiation, weighing what she could offer against what she could threaten. She thought of reminding him how difficult the market could be for someone leaving a company like Wexford Meridian under any kind of cloud, then thought better of it, aware that no cloud existed for her to invoke. She thought of appealing to his years of service, then remembered that those same years were precisely what she had just spent an entire meeting devaluing. Every angle she considered led back to the same uncomfortable place, that she had nothing left to offer him that he actually wanted, and nothing left to threaten him with that would actually work. She recovered quickly, shifting into a different kind of pressure, listing everything he stood to lose: his seniority, his internal relationships, the stability he claimed to value so much, his credibility with clients who trusted the Wexford Meridian name specifically. Then came the line meant to cut the deepest, that Grant Holloway did not actually want him. He only wanted whatever Caleb knew about how the company operated. Caleb answered evenly, noting that it seemed strange, then, that Grant had offered him this exact role 6 months before yesterday's meeting had even happened. Vivienne had no response to that, and for the first time she seemed to understand that this had never been about leverage at all. Caleb told her plainly that he would complete a full transition, hand over every piece of documentation properly, and take absolutely nothing that belonged to the company with him. That detail mattered more than either of them fully realized in the moment, because it meant Caleb would leave with a record so clean that no future accusation against him would ever hold up under scrutiny. Still, Vivienne assumed the transition would be simple, and within days she had already reassigned the Redmont Aviation account to a younger executive she had personally been grooming, a man named Preston Hale. Caleb offered only one piece of advice on his way out, telling her to make sure Preston actually read the renewal notes before his first call with the client. "We will manage," Vivienne said, closing the folder as though the matter were already settled. 2 days later, her phone rang with a call from the chief executive of Redmont Aviation himself, opening the conversation with a question that clearly caught her off guard, asking why he was hearing that Caleb Rowan had left the company from someone entirely outside of Wexford Meridian. Caleb officially joined Holloway North and Pierce that same week, though Grant made a point of not letting him anywhere near his old accounts right away. There would be no calls to Redmont, no outreach to any client connected to Wexford Meridian, nothing that could later be framed as poaching. Grant wanted Caleb to prove himself in unfamiliar territory first, and Caleb agreed without hesitation, understanding exactly why that boundary mattered. Back at Wexford Meridian, cracks were already beginning to show. Preston Hale did not understand the specific commitments Caleb had quietly built with Redmont over the previous months, and small deadlines began slipping in ways that would have been unthinkable only weeks earlier. Vivienne assumed the client was simply being difficult, unwilling yet to consider that the difficulty might be coming from her own side of the table. Preston Hale was not incompetent, only unprepared, thrown into a relationship with layers of history he had never been given the chance to learn. He inherited a spreadsheet of notes, but not the context behind them, the specific promises Caleb had made about delivery windows, the particular executive at Redmont who needed a phone call instead of an email whenever a problem arose, the small courtesies that had never been written down anywhere because they had simply lived inside Caleb's daily habits. Preston tried to catch up quickly, staying late most nights and reading through months of correspondence, but the gap between reading about a relationship and actually having built it proved wider than anyone at Wexford Meridian had anticipated. Small mistakes accumulated the way they always do, a missed callback here, a report delivered a day late there, nothing catastrophic on its own, but each one chipping away at a foundation that had taken 6 exhausting weeks to rebuild the first time. Redmont eventually requested an emergency call with senior leadership, and during that call, executives asked pointed questions Preston clearly was not prepared to answer. Vivienne, frustrated, told them flatly that Caleb Rowan did not run the company. One of the Redmont executives answered simply that he might not have run it, but he certainly seemed to be the only person who understood their business, a remark that landed harder than Vivienne expected in front of her own team. Meanwhile, at Holloway, Caleb was assigned to rescue a struggling account entirely unrelated to his previous work, with no shortcuts and no inside knowledge to lean on. He used the same instincts that had built his reputation in the first place, listening before proposing anything, identifying the actual root problem instead of the surface complaint, refusing to let his own team overpromise, and setting deadlines the department could genuinely meet. Within a few short weeks, the account stabilized, and Grant personally shared the results with the rest of the leadership team. The bonus Vivian had refused to pay in full was, in hindsight, a rounding error compared to the revenue Caleb was already beginning to generate for the very company she considered beneath her attention. Vivian began spending more time than usual reviewing account dashboards herself, something she had rarely done in years, paging through numbers late in the evening, long after her assistant had gone home, searching for a pattern that would explain the growing unease she felt but could not yet name. She told herself the dip in client satisfaction scores was seasonal, that Redmont's frustration was an isolated case rather than an early signal of something larger. She told herself Preston simply needed more time to grow into the role, ignoring the small voice reminding her that Caleb had never needed anyone to hand him that kind of runway in the first place. She even considered, briefly, reaching out to Caleb directly to ask his advice on stabilizing the account, then dismissed the idea almost as quickly as it arrived, unwilling to hand him the satisfaction of being needed again so soon after the meeting where she had told him plainly that he was not. Not long after, an email landed in her inbox that made the stakes suddenly very real, a formal notice from Redmont Aviation announcing a competitive review of their account. They were opening the relationship to outside bids, and one of the firms invited into that process was Holloway North and Pierce. Vivian began to panic quietly, though she was not yet ready to admit any fault of her own in what was unfolding. Instead, she built an entirely different narrative for the board, suggesting Caleb had planned his exit strategically and may have intended all along to bring key clients with him to a competitor. Vivian's insistence on the review said more about her than it did about Caleb, and privately, Edwin suspected as much, though he was careful not to say it out loud in front of the board. He had watched her operate long enough to recognize the pattern, the instinct to look for someone else to blame, whenever a decision she made began to unravel in front of people whose opinion actually mattered to her. It was easier to imagine Caleb as a calculating opportunist who had engineered his own departure than to sit with the far simpler explanation that she had pushed away the one person consistently holding several of her biggest relationships together. Still, Edwin authorized the review because refusing outright would have meant a confrontation he was not yet ready to have with her directly, and so the request moved forward. Edwin Carrick was not entirely convinced, but Vivian pushed for an internal review anyway, asking the technology team to check Caleb's email history, file downloads, storage device activity, and any exports from the client relationship system before his departure. The technology team took nearly a week to compile everything, cross-referencing login timestamps against document access logs and comparing them to the exact hours Caleb had spent finishing his transition materials. Every entry told the same story: long days spent writing detailed handoff notes rather than quietly copying anything for future use, calls made to internal colleagues walking them through open items rather than calls made to any outside number. The investigator assigned to the review, a methodical woman named Carol Pruitt who had handled dozens of similar audits over the years, later told Edwin privately that she had rarely seen an exit this clean, joking that most departing employees left messier trails accidentally deleting a single old file than Caleb had left on purpose. The results, when they came back, worked directly against her. Caleb had not downloaded a single client list. He had not forwarded documents to a personal account. He had not violated a single internal policy on his way out the door. In fact, during his final week, He had built a transition document far more thorough than company standard, anticipating questions his successor would eventually need answered. Vivienne still refused to let the matter go, calling Grant Holloway directly and hinting that legal action might follow if Caleb had engaged with any former client inappropriately. Grant asked her a simple question in return, whether she actually had any evidence at all. She had none. Grant let the silence sit there for a moment before answering, unhurried, the way he handled most difficult conversations. He was not interested in scoring a point against a rival executive, only in making sure she understood exactly what her own audit had already proven. He mentioned, almost as an aside, that his legal team had reviewed the situation independently before Caleb ever signed anything, precisely because Grant had wanted to avoid any appearance of wrongdoing on either side. That, he told her, was simply what it looked like when a company actually valued the person it was bringing on board, rather than treating the entire hire as a convenient inconvenience. Then maybe your problem is not that Caleb took something with him, Grant told her. Maybe it is that you never understood what walked out that door in the first place. It was the first time anyone outside her own company had spoken to her that directly, and it landed harder than any internal complaint ever could have. Around the same time, Grant informed Caleb that Holloway intended to submit a formal proposal for the Redmont Aviation account, and asked whether Caleb wanted to step aside to avoid any appearance of conflict. Caleb chose to participate, but drew a clear line for himself, agreeing only to work from information Redmont provided fresh during the new bidding process, refusing to touch anything from his time at his previous employer. It kept the competition honest, and it kept his own conscience clean, which mattered to him more than winning ever could. When the shortlist came back, only 2 companies remained in contention: Wexford Meridian and Holloway North and Pierce, and the man leading the presentation for Holloway was Caleb Rowan. In the days leading up to the pitch, Caleb prepared the way he always had, not by rehearsing clever lines, but by returning to the same discipline that had defined every account he ever touched, understanding the client's actual problem before proposing a single solution. He spoke with Redmont's operations team about bottlenecks that never made it into the formal briefing documents, asked questions about their internal politics that most consultants would have considered irrelevant, and built a plan around the people who would actually have to live with it every day. Grant reviewed the proposal once, made a handful of small suggestions, and otherwise stayed out of Caleb's way entirely, trusting the instincts that had already proven themselves once inside a company that no longer valued them. On the day of the final pitch, Vivian walked into the conference room and found Caleb already seated across the table, calmly organizing his materials as though this were any other Tuesday. There was no Wexford badge clipped to his jacket anymore, no seat tucked quietly behind more senior executives. His name appeared directly on the screen behind him: Caleb Rowan, Vice President of Strategic Accounts. Before the meeting began, Vivian leaned close enough to speak privately, telling him to enjoy the title while it lasted. Caleb answered simply, wishing her good luck that day and nothing more. Wexford Meridian presented first, with polished slides and impressive figures. But the presentation leaned heavily on the strength of the company's name rather than any concrete plan for the specific problems Redmont was currently facing. Holloway presented second, and Caleb never once mentioned the fact that he had personally saved this exact account only months earlier under a different letterhead. Instead, he focused entirely on the challenges Redmont was likely to face over the coming year, walking through a plan built specifically around their situation rather than a generic pitch reused from another client. At one point, he even acknowledged a gap in his own company's proposal compared to what Wexford had offered, then explained plainly how Holloway intended to close it. That honesty caught the room's attention in a way polish alone never could have. When someone from Redmont asked directly why Holloway seemed better positioned to execute than Wexford Meridian, Caleb did not criticize his former employer at all. Accountability has to belong to a person, he said, not a logo. And Vivian, sitting only a few feet away, understood immediately that he was describing the exact reason she had lost him in the first place. Redmont did not announce a decision that day. Instead, they informed both companies that Holloway North and Pierce had been invited into a period of exclusive negotiation, a signal Vivian understood the moment she read it. By the time she returned to her own office, an email was already waiting from Richard Ashbourne, chairman of the board, calling an emergency review focused on executive compensation and client retention. For the first time since Caleb had walked out of that conference room weeks earlier, the story inside Wexford Meridian was no longer about him at all. It was about her. Richard Ashbourne had chaired the board for nearly a decade, long enough to have seen executives come and go, long enough to recognize the particular smell of a story someone was trying too hard to control. He had backed Vivian for years, impressed by her instincts for optics and her ability to keep major clients smiling in public even when internal operations were far messier than anyone outside the company realized. But he had also learned, over those same years, that the quietest people in a room were often the ones actually holding it together. And something about the timing of Caleb's departure told him this review needed to go further than a routine formality. He asked Edwin to prepare a full account, not a summary, insisting on seeing the underlying numbers rather than the version that had already been shaped for presentation. The board wanted to understand exactly why a person responsible for generating so much of the company's revenue had left almost immediately after a routine compensation review, and Edwin Carrick was asked to produce the full record. The truth, once assembled, was difficult to dispute. Caleb had met every single performance target that quarter without exception. The reduction in his bonus had nothing to do with output at all. Vivian had used her discretionary authority to trim individual payouts in order to protect the incentive pool reserved for senior leadership, a decision that was not fraudulent, but was, by any reasonable measure, remarkably short-sighted. Worse still, an older internal email surfaced during the review, one in which Edwin had warned Vivian months earlier that Caleb represented a genuine retention risk, noting that Holloway had already approached him once before. Her written response was blunt, stating that he would not leave because he needed the stability too much to walk away. That single sentence undid nearly every argument she tried to offer the board that afternoon. She had known the risk existed, and she had gambled anyway, believing his family situation would keep him locked in place, regardless of how he was treated. Richard Ashbourne asked how much money the company had actually saved by reducing Caleb's bonus that quarter, and Edwin provided the figure. Then Richard asked how much revenue was currently at risk because of his departure, and the second number dwarfed the first by an enormous margin. Nobody in the room spoke for several seconds afterward. Later that same week, Redmont Aviation confirmed publicly what everyone already suspected, that Holloway North and Pierce had officially won the account. The board review itself stretched across nearly 3 hours, far longer than the single afternoon Vivian had originally allotted for it on her calendar. Different executives were called in one at a time to answer questions about their own departments, and though most of the conversation orbited around client retention numbers, several board members quietly began asking broader questions about how compensation decisions were made across the company as a whole. Richard Ashbourne, in particular, wanted to understand whether Caleb's situation had been an isolated lapse in judgment, or a symptom of something structural, a leadership culture that consistently undervalued the people actually holding client relationships together while rewarding those who managed appearances instead. Nobody in the room offered a confident answer, and the silence that followed told its own story. In the months that followed, 2 additional clients requested formal strategy reviews with Wexford Meridian, though not every account left the company, and the story never pretended otherwise. Enough friction surfaced, however, for the board to recognize that Caleb had quietly been absorbing operational weaknesses leadership never fully understood existed. Vivian was instructed to present a formal corrective plan, and eventually she was forced to do the one thing she had hoped never to do again: reach out directly to Caleb Rowan. She suggested meeting somewhere neutral, a small coffee shop near her old office, and Caleb agreed, not because he wanted to return, but because he wanted the entire chapter properly closed. In the days before the meeting, Vivian rehearsed the conversation more than she wanted to admit to anyone, drafting different openings in her head during long drives home, discarding each one for sounding either too defensive or too transparent about how much the board had actually taken from her. Part of her still believed that if she simply offered enough, the entire episode could be folded neatly back into the story of a company that occasionally made mistakes and then corrected them. Another part of her, quieter and harder to acknowledge, understood that no title or salary figure was going to undo the particular sentence she had once used against a man raising a child alone. Caleb arrived a few minutes early and took a seat near the window, watching the ordinary rhythm of a coffee shop that had nothing to do with glass towers or quarterly reviews, and something about the plainness of it settled him before Vivian ever walked through the door. When she did arrive, she looked different than he remembered from that conference room weeks earlier, still composed, but visibly carrying the weight of a board that no longer treated her decisions as untouchable. She ordered a coffee she barely touched, folded her hands on the table, and for a moment simply looked at him without the practiced authority she usually led with. She arrived without the boardroom posture that had once defined every conversation between them. Instead, she offered him a formal proposal, the title of Executive Vice President, a salary higher than what Holloway currently paid him, a guaranteed bonus structure, and full authority to rebuild the client strategy division from the ground up. A month earlier, this would have been the exact role he once quietly hoped to earn through years of loyalty. "We are prepared to correct the mistake," she told him, and Caleb asked, evenly, which mistake she meant. She hesitated, and in that hesitation Caleb spoke again, asking whether she meant cutting his bonus or believing he would accept an apology, now simply because she once assumed he could not afford to walk away. Vivian said nothing for a long moment, the reality finally settling in that this had never been a negotiation tactic on his part. The money had only ever clarified something Caleb already suspected about how little his years of work had actually been valued. "I underestimated you," she finally admitted. "No," Caleb answered, "you understood exactly what I did. You underestimated what it was worth." He slid the offer letter gently back across the table toward her, without anger, without ceremony, simply closing the distance between where they had started and where they now stood. Caleb declined the offer without mockery and without a lengthy speech, telling her only that Holloway had given him something Wexford Meridian never had: authority equal to the responsibility he actually carried. He stood, thanked her for the coffee, and walked out without looking back. Weeks later, Wexford Meridian announced a quiet restructuring of its leadership responsibilities. Vivian was not removed from the company, and the story never needed her to be. But her direct control over client strategy was stripped away and placed under a newly hired chief operating officer, brought in specifically to rebuild trust with the board. Her authority over compensation decisions was significantly limited going forward, subject now to a level of oversight she had never once imagined applying to her. The woman who had once insisted that no single employee was irreplaceable now answered to committees for decisions she used to make alone in a glass office on the 41st floor. Preston Hale, to his credit, stayed on and slowly grew into a competent account manager. Once the new operating structure gave him actual mentorship instead of simply inheriting a relationship he had never been prepared to run. Redmont's departure ended up serving as a wake-up call the entire organization needed. prompting a broader review of how the company trained and supported the people responsible for its most important relationships. It was, in its own quiet way, the very lesson Caleb had tried to demonstrate for 8 years without ever once being asked to explain it. Caleb, meanwhile, did not become wealthy overnight, and the story never pretended that he did. He simply walked into another conference room at Holloway North and Pierce, this time as the person clients specifically asked to see. When a new client eventually asked who would be personally responsible for their account, Grant Holloway did not gesture toward a slide deck or a logo on the wall. He looked directly at Caleb and said only 2 words, "He does." Caleb accepted the responsibility without hesitation, exactly the way he always had. Later that afternoon, Grant stopped by his office for a few minutes, not to check on the new account, but simply to ask how the transition into the role was settling, the kind of ordinary question Caleb had rarely been asked in 8 years at his previous company. Caleb admitted it still felt strange sometimes, being asked for his opinion in a room instead of being expected to quietly absorb whatever decision had already been made above him. Grant told him that strange feeling would fade, the way most things do once a person stops waiting for the other shoe to drop, and left it at that, without turning the moment into anything larger than it needed to be. As the meeting wrapped up, his phone buzzed quietly on the table, a message from Avery asking whether he would be home for dinner that night. This time, without checking the clock twice or weighing what still needed to be finished, he simply answered, "Absolutely." He gathered his things and walked toward the elevator at the end of the hall, passing a row of offices where junior staff were already learning his name the same way people once learned it at his old company, quietly, through results rather than introductions. The same soft chime rang out, the same metal doors sliding open in front of him. This time, though, he stepped inside, carrying no bonus that had just been quietly cut in half, no reminder of his place in someone else's hierarchy. He carried a title that reflected what he actually did, authority that matched the trust people placed in him, and a future no longer tethered to whether Vivian Wexford ever chose to acknowledge his worth. She had cut his bonus that day to remind him she believed he could be replaced. Her real mistake was giving him every reason he needed to prove that the one person who was never actually replaceable had been standing in that room the whole time.